So I'm joined by a new friend who I actually just met in person for the first time last week, Chris Elston, known as Billboard Chris. And we had such a, even though it was brief, good conversation in a short amount of time that I said, you want to come out to Columbus, Ohio and, teach me more about this issue that I've been talking about. I've paid some attention to it, but from a very different angle than Chris. He said yes, and here we are a week later in Columbus, Ohio. We met at CPAC, and so it's good to see you, man.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a big honor to be here.
Well, tell me, we were so brief. We were rushing at CPAC and distracted at the time. But I know you're Canadian. I know what you've been focused on. But if you can just tell me a little bit about you, what brought you to this journey? I know you were a financial advisor. We were both in a similar world before. It's a very different world you're in now. I think that goes for both of us. Just give me 5 minutes on that.
So my greatest joy in life and my biggest job in life is that of being a dad. And I have two girls who are my entire world. They're 11 and 13 years old now. When I started my campaign of conversations across North America, they were 8 and 10. And I had learned about this business of trying to transition children to the opposite sex or gender.
When was this starting? This was a couple
back
years ago?
in 2019 is when I first heard this term puberty blockers. And as a dad of two little girls, I said, what the heck are those? And I looked it up, and sure enough, kids are receiving these drugs which stop their bodies going into puberty. Which, if you pause and think about that for a moment, it's totally insane. We are stopping the physical development of perfectly healthy children because they've been taught this lie that they're born in the wrong body. And my message is one of body positivity that we should be sending, which is that children are beautiful just as they are, that there's no right way to be a boy or a girl. If a boy is more effeminate or if a girl is a tomboy, well, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
What are we doing giving children experimental drugs that have been used to treat prostate cancer, endometriosis in women? Same drug given to pedophiles to chemically castrate them. But we give it to children off-label because it happens to stop puberty. We then give them the opposite sex's hormones. And yes, surgeries are even being done on children. We have all the proof in the world for this. So I just became very concerned, and I started reading more about this. And the more I read, the worse it got. And I feel like we're dealing with this pseudo-religious movement, or a huge cult, really, in society. And I didn't want to look back at my life in 40 years and say I did nothing about it. So I basically had a vision for what I felt I could do to just play my part in raising awareness about this. And I've been on a mission ever since.
Well, how did you get the title Billboard Chris, though, specifically?
So back in July of 2020 in England, this fabulous woman named Posey Parker put up a sign at the Edinburgh train station. It was very controversial because it said, I love J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author.
Yeah, she put it up in Edinburgh.
This woman put it up. Her name's Posey Parker. That I heart J.K. Rowling. It lasted one day because some people on Twitter complained that it was hateful, and they took it down.
That was it.
That was it. They did a freedom of information request, and there were 2 or 3 complaints. So they took it down, this government-run train authority. And I'm a big freedom of speech guy. We should be able to talk about an issue medically affecting children. We should be able to have a conversation.
I think we should be able to talk about any issue. That includes, medically affecting children, of course. Yeah.
You're right. But when we are causing irreversible harm in otherwise perfectly healthy children, and we're not allowed to talk about this without being called some sort of bigot, as a father, I reject that outright. As a citizen of the free world, I reject that. So I followed her lead, and in Vancouver, Canada, I put up a big billboard that said the same exact thing. I heart J.K. Rowling.
Oh, you actually literally said the exact same...
The same message. Because my whole goal is to start conversations.
Okay. So then what happened in Canada? Same thing?
It got paint bombed overnight. And then a Vancouver politician said it was hate speech. And she pressured the sign company.
The thing I love about that is you've got to be strategic about this, right? And you were. So it's not, I mean this in a good way. It wasn't totally innocent, right? But it's like the perfect troll to start a conversation, which is something as simple as I love J.K. Rowling, famous, renowned, multi-million book sale author.
But
And to say you
it's
love
also
her
true.
was hate speech. Interesting.
Yeah, and they took it down.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
it
love how
is-
J.K. Rowling was very popular when Dumbledore was gay,
Right.
but they came for their own. And do you actually think that was a little bit aside, Eddie here, but do you think that's part of why they came for her so viciously? Because it gets one thing if it was you or I that made the statements she did about the trans movement, which has a religiosity to it that she did a good job of calling out, and hypocrisy. But it feels like for them, maybe it was a betrayal, because back when the LGBTQIA plus was still focused on the L and the G, she was perceived as an ally, right? Because Dumbledore was gay. Dumbledore was like I think the character in Harry Potter, yeah. And so I don't know. Do you think it was the sense of betrayal that made them come for her as aggressively as they did, or do you think it? I think it's even more than they would have if it would have been somebody who was just perceived as being on the other side.
Yes, I think absolutely. She's a lifetime leftist. She's a feminist.
She is, right? I was pretty sure about that. Okay,
Yeah, 100%. She's donated herself out of the billionaire class because she's given so much to charities to help the underprivileged. She's a wonderful woman. So when I put up that sign that said I love J.K. Rowling, it was true. I did love her. And I also happened to be reading all the Harry Potter novels with my little one at night, every night, for about a year and a half straight during that time period.
Well, it's really funny because that's the thing about this, I would say cultish trans religion is it's totally incompatible with the liberal movements that created the very foundation for its emergence, right? Because you just take like the fact that J.K. Rowling is a feminist. The trans movement denies the essence of different possibilities for what women can be, right? It says that if you are a woman, you must be the prototype of what a woman is supposed to be: breast size, lip size, voice, whatever it is. So much so that if you're any different, then that actually denies your status as a woman, which undercuts the very premise of most of the first three waves of feminism, which is that you can be a woman in whatever way you want and still be a woman without having to fit society's stereotype of how you're supposed to look or talk or act as a woman. Screw that. That was the whole premise of much. And I think one that I find motivating, right? I mean, this is a show and a set of conversations about self-confidence. Part of self-confidence is to say that I'm not going to fit some societal stereotype. And yet now, one of the core premises of the trans movement is that if you really want to be a woman, it's not just about identifying with femininity, but that you actually have to have these affirming surgeries in order to fit that description, because you have to look the part. It's quite contradictory.
You nailed it. This whole ideology is about stereotypes. So it's funny because these people, this is really the far left that's pushing this. It's not everyone on the left. And we can get into this, but everyone needs to understand that 90% of the population support our message here. It's not a radical thing to say that we shouldn't be maiming and sterilizing kids, changing their names and pronouns at school without their parents' knowledge. This is an issue that gets widespread support from people from all over the political spectrum. I have had more conversations about this subject out on the street with people from all walks of life than anyone in the world. So you'd asked how I got started with the Billboard Chris name. I put up that big billboard.
J.K. Rowling. Yep.
Yeah, it got taken down. News went viral. I leveraged the outrage into a quick little fundraising campaign, and a week later, had the same billboard up in San Francisco, then Los Angeles, Portland, all throughout Utah.
Nonprofit?
Yeah. I didn't set up a nonprofit, but
it was just like not for profit, right?
I made sure I lost money, actually.
Yeah, good.
So that people couldn't say I was trying to grift.
Great. I appreciate that.
And I made sure I had some people hold me accountable for every single dollar.
Yeah.
So that
I think
no
if you're
one
doing
could say
something worthy,
anything.
there's no problem with making money, but I'm the same way. It's like if you're doing it for a cause, why not just defang that criticism and not?
Exactly.
Okay, good. So anyway.
And then Times Square, all throughout the metro in DC. So that was all through September. Billboards all throughout America. They all stayed up because freedom of speech is still alive and well in the United States of America.
Alive and on life support.
Sure.
Okay.
But it's enshrined in the
exists.
Constitution.
Exactly.
And unlike Canada, there's no subject to clause like we have in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Oh, can you just say a word about that? Actually,
Sure.
So I should know more about this, but the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is like the equivalent of the Constitution in Canada, no?
That's right. So we have freedom of assembly.
And so even in the founding document or in the charter there's a qualification to free speech?
Section 1, the very first section, it basically says, these are the rights enshrined in it's not our constitution, but these are the rights given to all Canadians: freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, all those similar concepts. But Section 1 says, subject to lawmakers as is reasonable in a, normal society or whatever. So there's a subject to clause.
Subject to lawmakers as is acceptable in a reasonable society.
Those aren't the exact words, but
yeah, actually, I'm going to take a look at what those are. Yeah,
yeah, it's.
Do you mind?
I'll read it to you right now.
Do you mind if we just do that right now? Actually, yeah.
I
mean, I'm a fan of. You got my attention with this because I think I'm a big fan of learning about other countries that are also supposedly liberal, self-governing democracies, but the micro differences between America and those countries actually teaches us more about America and what makes or ought to make us different. That's one of my passions. I mean, the whole premise of my presidential candidacy is answering the question of what it means to be an American, and sometimes you need to see the contrast a little bit to remember who we really are. Canada gives us great fodder for that because there's so much apparent cultural similarity, yet distinctions like this one, I think actually are useful for an American to learn about. So did you?
I did.
Yeah.
So we have all these similar rights, but Section 1 says the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society.
That immediately takes the teeth out of the whole thing.
Subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law. Who makes law?
Who makes law?
Lawmakers.
It's circular because the whole point of a constitution, or in this case, what do they call it? The Charter
of Rights and Freedoms.
Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is to serve as the governing constraint on lawmaking. If you have a free ratchet that allows it to override, that's one giant circle, which is like one of the things I appreciate about this country. I think sometimes we don't, I'm saying about the United States now, this country, is that we have a clear order of hierarchy. The Constitution governs, and then that's the basis for making federal laws and then state laws. Everything is subsidiary still to the Constitution. And it's even part of why we put the Second Amendment in there, which was to say that not only the First Amendment's the most important one. It was called first for a reason, enshrines, among other things, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. But the Second Amendment is unique, actually, to the United States, even amongst a lot of other free societies. I don't think there's an equivalent of a Second Amendment in Canada, which is effectively right to bear arms, right?
We'll get into that, but no, I can't even carry pepper spray. I can't wear body armor.
Okay.
And I get attacked.
That's very Canadian. But it also shows how a culture is shaped in the shadow of its founding document. I mean, it's like I've run a company before. Companies without mission statements wither into nothingness. And countries without mission statements effectively wither into nothingness too, unless there's like a common ethnicity or something to ground them. Canada and the United States don't have that, but the United States, at least in the form of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, has a founding statement. Second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution, and even the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. That's a pretty darn good statement of a mission statement of a country and the principles by which it abides. But we have the Second Amendment to really put teeth into the first and the rest. Whereas, I don't mean to be picking on my Canadian friends here, but they have a qualifier that just takes everything in the Charter of Rights and just completely guts it by saying it's subject to reasonable standards of lawmaking, when actually it was the lawmaking that the Charter was supposed to constrain. It's kind of weird, right?
The Founding Fathers got it so right. Our rights are not ours to be given to us. We have these rights.
They're inalienable.
They're inalienable. They're not granted by the government. In Canada, they're granting us these rights.
Yeah, which means they're not rights at all. But the inalienable part is interesting because, like, what did John Locke mean, even when we were borrowing from this concept of inalienability? It not only means that someone else can't take them away from you, it even in a strict sense means you can't alienate it, separate it from yourself. It's part of your own personhood. When I think about self-confidence as an issue, like that's one of the things that you got to remember is that the rights that you have, they belong to you so much that you don't even have a choice to give it up, right? Slavery is not a choice. So self-confidence, self-affirmation is the only way. That's part of what's led me to be successful. Part of what I think should lead other young people to be successful. It's part of what it means to be American. But I want to bring that back to this concept of how they've co-opted this idea of affirmation into gender affirmation. What's going on there? And I would say just try the clothes on of the other side for a second. When they're saying affirm the gender, walk through that a little bit for me. Try, because we don't have an advocate of that point of view here, but you understand it. What would they say if they were here about what it means to affirm a child's gender and how that affirms who they are? Put the best argument on the table, because I'm having a lot of trouble on this one seeing it, and I would like to.
Okay, sure. And I'll just quickly finish up what I do.
Yeah.
So after all these billboards, because I couldn't put up any signs in Canada, and I have no platform, and I'm just a dad from the suburbs, I'm nobody, I decided to become a billboard, because they can take down my actual sign, but they can't take one off my back.
Okay.
So I went outside and I had signs made, which I wear because it's just convenient. And I know I look ridiculous, but I have these signs that I wear with the message that children cannot consent to puberty blockers. I've got my definition of a dad, which is a human male who protects his kids from gender ideology. And I have conversations out on the street. I go to downtown centers, I go to university campuses, I go to wherever it's busy. And I've been traveling North America ever since the borders opened up. All my trips are into the US. And I've had more than 10,000 conversations out on the street, knowing that just this mission of having conversations would lead to massive awareness, and it's working. So regarding your question of this affirmation business with children, what are they affirming? They're affirming a lie that a child might be born wrong. These kids are being taught that just because they don't conform to regressive sexist stereotypes, that they must be born in the wrong body, that they have a gender identity which is different than their biological sex, and that they won't find true happiness unless they medically transition. When the body positive message we should be sending is that you are beautiful just as you are. There's no right way to be a boy or a girl. What are we doing with these kids? Even a pronoun change is not a harmless, benign act. As the medical board in England has even pointed out, this is a powerful psychosocial intervention that essentially teaches a child. You're telling a child every time you use the wrong pronouns that they were born wrong, that there's something wrong with them. They should have been different.
And now the origin story here is grounded in, we were just talking about this a little bit ago. I studied biology undergrad. I got into it actually taking a genetics class in the fall of 2003 at Harvard when they were in the middle of the genomics revolution. So that was part of what pulled me into it. There is this idea of the reality of intersex, that there is, it's extraordinarily rare, but you have people who are, XXY, where they'll get an extra chromosome, or, genetic anomalies that actually create super rare cases. We studied this back in 2003, where people are intersex, that they're not either one sex or another, even hermaphrodite type phenotypes, which is exceedingly rare.
Let me touch on that, though.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So in 0.018% of the cases, I've done my research on this and I've talked to professional biologists, etc. In 0.018% of these cases, they are what they call intersex. We should probably more accurately call it a disorder of sexual development, because that's all it is.
And there's a genetic basis. You can literally see the genes or the chromosomes in this case, right?
Yeah. So there's a single X chromosome, or there's XXY, XXXY, conditions like Klinefelter syndrome or Turner syndrome. But these people are all ultimately still male or female. It's ultimately our gametes that we produce, or we were meant to produce, in spite of whatever, genetic dysfunction that determine our sex. It's not just XX or XY. Someone who is XXY is male. Someone with Klinefelter syndrome, like Caster Semenya, this famous track athlete from South Africa, who was racing with the women and crushing them in all these sprinting events. Well, it turns out Caster Semenya had Klinefelter syndrome, and was born with the testes internalized, but still male. Mm-hmm. But these are extremely rare cases, and these trans activists just try to sideline the conversation to make it about that, when it's not at all what we're talking about here. We're talking about just kids who don't have any of these disorders of sexual development that have fallen into a social contagion, which teaches them that just because they don't conform to stereotypes, that they must have been born in the wrong body.
Yeah, and the point I was making is those are, at least, like, let's talk about those hard cases separately. But we've got this like tail wagging the dog problem where, are there actual intersex issues genetically? Sure, there are. Now, I come down on your side too, is that we can still solve for that. If you have a Y chromosome, you're a man. If you don't, you're a woman.
Correct.
Period.
Yeah.
Pretty simple.
Yeah.
But I'll acknowledge that actually I could say pretty simple, but there's some complexity there that's like in 0.0 or 0.0001% of cases. There's genetic anomalies of many kind. That's one of them. Maybe even in very rare cases, you also have a true condition of not societally created, but innate gender dysphoria, which is exceedingly rare, but can be a condition of great suffering in 1 in 100, probably less than 1 in 100,000 or whatever would be the actual true case of such a thing. Is that about right for ballpark purposes?
It depends on the time period you're looking at, but it was maybe 1 out of 40,000 boys and probably half that for girls.
Yes, so 1 out of 80,000. Okay, so I'm in the ballpark.
Yeah.
But if I feel like in this, I think common cause that we share in combating the modern religion of gender ideology, we can acknowledge that those are corner cases that we'll put to one side, while saying that actually, if those cases are sources of great human suffering, maybe we can even accept that premise. But then ask the question of why on earth we would go out of our way as a society to make sure that more people suffer that same fate of confusion. And just the question on my mind is, what the heck is going on in our culture? Like, I have my view on this, but I want to hear yours. What's going on that created that all of a sudden in the last half decade, really, is when we've seen the explosion of this? What's going on?
Yeah, this really exploded in around 2015, which happens to coincide with the year that Bruce Jenner came out as Caitlyn Jenner, and this show, I Am Jazz, following the story of a very young boy that his mom was transitioning from a young age, was made into a reality show. Celebrating the medical transition of a young child.
I'm actually not familiar with that. What show is that?
I Am Jazz.
Separate from the Jenner incident.
Yeah, so this was a little boy named Jazz Jennings, who his mom became convinced was actually a girl.
And how old was Jazz, sorry?
I don't know when the show started, but like this has been going on since when he was 3 or 4 or 5. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, this happens. There's a lot of moms actually pushing this.
So he's a boy.
He's a boy.
He has male sex organs.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with him.
It's not like the intersex. It's X and Y chromosome.
No.
Just X and Y chromosome. Right?
That's right.
Normal
Yeah.
male.
Yeah.
Okay. And then his mom becomes convinced he's a girl.
Yes.
Not a gay boy, nothing else. A girl.
Right.
And what does she do?
They started, first social transition.
Okay.
So giving him a girl's name and pronouns.
Okay.
So this is the psychological
intervention. So he starts to think of himself as a girl. Okay.
Yeah. And then the moment he hits puberty, and this isn't just him. This is being done to tens of thousands of children. And last year in the United States, 300,000 kids between the age of 12 and 17 were diagnosed with gender dysphoria. That's just those diagnosed. And just in that age bracket.
How many?
300,000.
In the United States?
In the United States, between the age of 12 and 17.
Last year?
Last year. There's a reason I'm doing what I do. I'm not just a crazy person.
300,000 in the U.S.?
That's correct. Between the age of 12 and 17.
So how many people are there between the age of 12 and 17 in the U.S.?
Yeah, humans live to be, 85 on average. So that's a 6-year
people.
window. We're talking about 8% of the population out of 350 million people. So we're looking at, 30 million. They're younger, so maybe 35, 40.
Yeah, but order of magnitude.
Yeah.
So that would be like 1%. Like if there's 100 kids, we're going to say one of the 100 kids.
But it's way higher.
Is gender dysphoria. No, but that alone is a staggering number diagnosed.
That's just diagnosed probably for insurance purposes.
Right.
It doesn't include the kids who aren't diagnosed, which are the majority.
Mm-hmm.
You get high schools now. They did a survey of all the Pittsburgh high schools. 10% of the kids said they were transgender or non-binary. These high schools now all over.
10%, yeah, said it. Self-reported.
Self-reported.
Because it's the cool thing to say.
It's cool. And it's cool to be LGBT of some sort. So half these kids in high school, especially the girls, say they're LGBT of some sort. Because it's, again, like all of these neo-Marxist ideologies that are creeping into our schools, there's this oppressor-victim teaching going on.
Of course.
Where if you're a white male like me, you're at the top of this oppression pyramid. But I can go instantly from being the top oppressor to one of the biggest victims if I simply declare myself to be a woman.
Sure. It's a response to incentives.
Yeah. And so kids who are struggling, because again, these kids, especially the ones who show up at gender clinics, they're all struggling with something. Half of these kids have autism.
Oh, really?
We have actual stats from the Tavistock, which is the biggest gender clinic in the world. It's being shut down in favor of a new model. But in England, out of more than 1,000 children, 35% of them had moderate to severe autism. If you include the mild cases, it goes about 50%. And if anyone wants to read evidence of this from someone who worked at a gender clinic, we have this whistleblower named Jamie Reed, who worked at the Washington University Transgender Clinic associated with the St. Louis Children's Hospital. And less than a month ago, she published a startling expose saying everything that people like myself have been saying in the free press. And she submitted an affidavit to the Attorney General of Missouri, where she confirms everything we've been saying. All of these kids are struggling with some mental health comorbidity. Autism is huge. Eating disorders, cutting. There might have been abuse, trauma. Sexual abuse is very common. You take a girl or a boy, and I've been out on the street having these conversations. I've talked to a lot of these kids. They come up to me out on the street, these teens. But a girl who's been sexually abused, she's not loving being a girl right now, is she? Because for her, this is the source of all of this trauma. And if you give these kids an escape route where they can just identify as a boy and escape being a girl, well, some of them are going to take you up on that. And that's what we're seeing. Kids in foster care are wildly overrepresented. It's all of the most vulnerable kids who are struggling with something. Sometimes they have several mental health comorbidities, as Jamie Reed, this whistleblower, has confirmed. And instead of helping them with these underlying mental health issues, they treat gender as the only issue that's causing everything. And on their very first appointment, they're getting puberty blockers or these cross-sex hormones, and they're getting surgeries. In Kaiser Permanente in California, I've got video of Kellen Lackhart, who's the psychiatrist there, admitting on camera that they cut off the breasts of a 12-year-old girl and they did penile inversion surgeries on 16-year-old boys.
Unbelievable. But the most important part of that story to me is that it ignores what else is actually going on in those kids' lives, right? This becomes a kind of cop-out, right? It's too easy for them to reaffirm a gender or affirm a gender. That's easy. The hard part would actually be addressing an underlying condition like autism or different conditions of mental health, or actually the circumstances that create kids who feel abandoned in foster care. Like, that's hard work. So let's do the easy stuff. It actually reminds me of, so I probably have dived deeper into the phenomenon of racial wokeism and the emergence of critical race theory in the schools to corporate America over the last few years. I've been increasingly focused on this critical trans theory, if we're to call it that, in the last few years too. But one of the things that was striking about the emergence of critical race theory in schools was the rise of dogmas like the idea that math is racist. Well, it's easy to call math racist if there's disparate outcomes for black kids and white kids, or black kids and Asian kids, which is even a bigger disparity. That's easy to point out, to then rail against math as racist, than it is to actually do the harder work of making sure the black kids actually know how to do math. And so they abandon the actual thing they're supposed to be focused on by latching on to this other narrative instead. It's almost a way of absolving yourself of accountability. And there's just something about what you said in the gender ideology version of this that rhymes with that. If it rhymes with it, if not the exact same thing, which is it's hard work to figure out what's going on for a kid that's not just confused about their gender, in fact, not confused about their gender at all, but just confused and lost in life. And now we pin it to gender. I guess like that would be if we're logically following that through, well, how much more grounded or self-confident or self-assured do they feel after having gone through the conversion?
Right.
That seems like a relevant question to ask.
So there's a lot to this, but essentially this ideology was floating around in academia for decades, this gender identity theory, and it's now emerged into the mainstream. And when gay rights were won, which is fine, people can love whoever they want. I'm fine with that. They just wanted to be treated as equals. This is about a denial of reality itself. And so when gay rights were won, you have all these LGBTQ organizations, which really we should just call TQ organizations.
That's what they are now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, for the L and the G are so passé at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. And they don't just close the doors and say, we won, we achieved our goals. They need to keep the donations flowing. Mm-hmm. They need to keep the doors open. They need to keep everyone employed. And so the objective moved from gay rights to trans rights. And they've conflated these things very successfully as being the same. And this has silenced everyone for a long time because they didn't really understand what was going on. But now they do.
Well, that seems ironic to conflate. I mean, I have a bit of a passion project to this modern habit of taking ungrammatically connected letters of the alphabet and just mashing them together. I mean, I think that's been part of my crusade against ESG. I mean, governance has nothing to do with environmental or social, right? They just mash them together, not as an accident that they don't have anything to do with each other, but precisely because they don't have anything to do with each other, because they use the G to justify the E and the S. But like that's sort of what's going on here with respect to, let's take the L and the G and somehow put it next to a T and a Q, when not only do they have nothing to do with each other, they're actually fundamentally in tension.
They're opposed.
Contradictory to one another. I mean, tell me if I'm thinking about this in overly simplistic terms, but a core premise of the gay rights movement in this country, for gay rights to be a civil right, was that the sex of the person you're attracted to had to be hardwired on the day you were born. It's like Lady Gaga style. I was born this way. Okay, if that was the case, and I think we can debate the evidence they had for that. But
sure, and a lot of gay people will debate that too. By the way,
a lot of gay people will debate that too.
Yeah.
Although it's a third rail you're not supposed to touch. Right. But because it had to be that way, or else you couldn't shoehorn it into the framework of civil rights, of inborn immutable characteristics. That same movement, when you then put it in the non-grammatical mishmash of alphabet soup, LGBTQIA plus for everything else that falls after the IA, now says that your own biological sex is effectively completely fluid over the course of your life. So your sex of the person you're attracted to, hardwired, your own sex completely fluid. And it requires you to espouse these fundamentally logically inconsistent premises at the exact same time. And the only conditions under which you have to vehemently accept logically contradictory impulses is a framework of religion. And a religion that hasn't withstood the test of time is nothing more than a cult.
Right.
Like that seems to be what's going on.
This has all the hallmarks of a cult. When you come into this, when one of these struggling children or young adults identify themselves as trans, what happens? Immediately they get love bombed. Like in any cult. They get showered with affection.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And admiration.
Maybe that's the real affirmation. Right? The affirmation that we're giving them a sense of their longing. They're people who probably don't fit in where they were anyway in foster care or who are autistic. It sounds like I didn't know that before.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these kids are just struggling to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And now they have a special identity, which gets celebrated. It gets celebrated by the whole school, by the teachers, by the administrators. They join special clubs where the indoctrination continues. And they're told that they're brave for finally being their true self. Well, as soon as these kids have regrets in the future, like my friend Chloe Cole, who was put on testosterone at the age of 13 at this same Kaiser Permanente in Oakland, California, where I was talking about that doctor who did a surgery on a 12-year-old. But Chloe Cole started on testosterone at 13. They cut off her breasts at 15. Less than a year later, she had massive regrets. She still has medical complications associated with these hormones and surgeries. But what happened when she realized that she's really a female? Was she celebrated for finding her true self? Of course not. She's showered with hate on a continual daily basis, given death threats, told she was never really... Yes, and she was never really trans. Oh, really? What does it mean then to be trans? If you cut off some of your body parts and you went on the opposite sex's hormones, you were never really trans? I always say transition is something you do. It's not something you are.
Yeah.
And it's never for kids. So this is essentially a label. Now, if an adult wants to give themselves some label and they want to modify their body, that's a different conversation entirely. Doctors still have an oath to first do no harm, and they should never go straight to the most invasive treatment. You shouldn't be an order taker for hormones as a doctor. But the adult conversation is a totally different conversation.
You know, where's the FDA on this? This actually, as somebody who came from a highly regulated biotech and pharma industry, this pisses me off, actually. So actually, you probably don't know this about me. I've worked on developing a number of medicines. 5 of them are FDA-approved products today. We sold off a portfolio of them for a $3 billion deal that I did, I think, late 2019, right at the end of the year. But one of the set of drugs in that batch was actually a chemical entity that was a hormonal therapy, now an approved drug for endometriosis, uterine fibroids, and as a monotherapy at a higher dose for prostate cancer. And I'm incredibly proud of the work that we did. I will tell you, the regulatory hoops that we had to jump through, the amount of money we had to spend in order to bend the knee to every FDA wish and command was staggering. It is offensive. I think women in this country should be offended by what the FDA makes you go through to get a drug approved for endometriosis. But it's all in the name of public safety. And then there's certain trials you have to do to show that these things are safe in different subpopulations. I mean, that's the meticulous. It's false. It's a farce. But the meticulousness of what they appear to make you go through in this veneer of capital S science, which is really just scientism as a religion in its own right. That's what contributes, by the way. Dirty little secret. You want to know why drugs are so expensive? It's because of the frickin' Food and Drug Administration. Okay. Now, that same FDA, where the hell are they when it comes to actually using those same chemical entities on an off-label basis where if you're in pharma, that's where they come down on you like a ton of bricks is if you're, using a drug or marketing a drug for an off-label purpose. We have an entire culture propagating the use of these drugs in kids to permanently change them such that they don't even have it's permanent damage. Such that if they ever decided that, hey, I was just going through a little bit of phase of adolescence, by the way, as I think we are as a country right now, that's a separate discussion, to come back and say, okay, I figured out who I am. Well, once you've used chemical and biological intervention, you don't have a chance to reverse that. Where the hell is the FDA on this? It's an affront seeing what I saw go through firsthand with this corrupt administrative agency that's purposefully asleep at the switch, turning a blind eye to this. What's going on there?
You nailed it. They're corrupt. So this drug given to kids, as like the drug you developed, is for prostate cancer and endometriosis and uterine fibroids.
Right?
Lupron.
Yep.
So that's the usual drug. There are some others they use. So technically, for the doctors watching this, these are gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonists that stop the pituitary gland from releasing luteinizing hormone and FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone. These in turn trigger testosterone in boys, estrogen in girls. This drug takes those hormones to zero. No testosterone, no estrogen. That's why these have been used on sex offenders to chemically castrate them, because it takes their testosterone down to nothing. But without these hormones, kids' secondary sex characteristics don't develop. So girls' breasts will not grow, boys' penises don't grow, girls' hips don't expand. One of the side effects of these drugs is bone demineralization. It's making their bones weaker at a time they should be getting stronger. A young girl in Sweden, part of a documentary, suffered spinal fractures and has osteopenia from this drug. The FDA did come out with a warning about 6 months ago saying that this drug is leading to brain swelling and permanent vision loss in some of these kids.
But where's their enforcement action on this? I mean,
but they're allowed to use this drug off-label. It's never been approved for this purpose. It was approved.
Now, I think one of the frameworks in this country is that the FDA's posture is that they don't regulate the practice of medicine that's done in the States. But the culture that sort of turns a blind eye to this, I mean, the kinds of things they will raise a public health emergency for, while purposefully turning a blind eye here, it's politics all the way down, because they know this would be a politically unpopular thing for them to step on, even though the standards they apply to the countless other uses of drugs in kids would be totally different if this weren't politically fraught. It's actually just one of the things that just gets on my nerves, which is the appearance of engaging in even-handed scientific public health considerations when in fact it's just politics all the way down. This is actually, we talk a lot about COVIDism, and yes, there's plenty to say there. This is the area where it's going on at the most rampant and harmful scale today. So I mean, I know we were just talking about it as we were walking in. You've been talking about at the state level what can be done to combat some of this. What are some thoughts?
So we need, obviously, states are now passing legislation. We've got about 20 states passing legislation to stop this. The problem with that is it'll go to court because you have organizations like the ACLU who will sue in every single instance. They will go to court and they say...
Well, let's talk about the legislation itself, actually.
Well, the legislation should be stopping giving these children puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery.
And children defined by age of 18?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So if you're under age 18, you can't get this surgery and you can't get this puberty blocker.
Right.
Like that's it. Is there like a diet version of this legislation which says that unless A, B, or C happens?
In Utah, they grandfathered in children who are already on puberty blockers.
Okay.
And the reason they've done that is so they're think
not
this
no man's
will
land in the middle, you know.
And they think this will survive a court challenge.
Okay.
Because all these laws are going to be challenged. Now, ideally, what states should be doing is what Florida did. They stopped this through the medical board, not through legislators. They're passing legislation now to shore that up. But the medical board looked at all the science, looked at all the evidence, found there wasn't any evidence to support this, and that the risks massively outweighed the benefits. We have other countries, Sweden, Finland, England, have done away with this practice because the medical boards looked into it and found there was no evidence to support it. And what people like myself have been requesting is for the American Academy of Pediatrics to conduct a systematic review of the evidence. Let's just look at the evidence for this, guys. Do a proper study. There's never been a proper study on kids. There are two lies that these trans activists have. They only have two things that they'll ever tell you. They'll say that puberty blockers are reversible.
False. Yeah.
That they just buy a child time to explore their gender identity. So this is a sales pitch. This sounds lovely. I used to be in sales. That's all this is. In reality, sure, if a kid went on puberty blockers for 3 months and came off, not too much harm done. Puberty would resume. But when you start a child onto these drugs, you're locking them into this medical pathway. Just the pronouns are putting them on this medical pathway because pronouns are never enough. They need to start medicalizing their body in order to be their true self. That's what they believe. But the puberty blockers, in 98% of cases, according to gender clinic statistics, these kids progress to the cross-sex hormones. These drugs and hormones together are sterilizing children. A girl on testosterone after 4 or 5 years has to get a hysterectomy because it causes vaginal and uterine atrophy. There are all sorts of other side effects we can get into. But we know from studies into real gender dysphoria, not this social contagion going on today where girls who grew up just feeling fine, full of confidence, wearing princess dresses, whatever, being tomboys, beautiful. But this isn't real gender dysphoria today. This is a craze catching adolescent girls who are having a tough time with puberty, a tough time with life. And this is being sold as a solution. And for these autistic children or these kids who don't fit in, these artsy kids, you know, the weird kids maybe, who don't feel like they fit in, they're being told that this is the reason why, because their gender identity is different. But we know from studies that 80 to 90% of the time, kids with severe gender dysphoria grew out of it. The best study we have, the most recent one as well, followed 139 boys from the age of 5 or 6 years old all the way into their 20s. 87.8% of them, their gender dysphoria went away. They just grew out of it. 63.6% grew up to be gay. So now we're taking kids who would grow up to be gay,
which is an assault on the gay rights movement,
and we're sterilizing them.
I mean, the hypocrisies just make my blood boil, and you know, every time I talk about this issue, yeah, that's it.
Sure, I give speeches, and I'll ask the women in the audience, can I please have a show of hands from all the women? Which of you loved going through puberty? How many hands do you think have gone up?
Not very many.
None.
Maybe a couple.
Zero.
None. Yeah. It's just the nature. It's just the nature of your journey into adulthood, and we just need to start. I think you can't hammer this into kids' minds, but one of the things I do say when I speak at a high school commencement or something like this is hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. Hardship is what helps us discover who we really are. And it sucks. But go through that on the other side of it. You know what's affirming? Hardship is affirming, actually. Not some adult giving you an affirmation of your gender. Not someone affirming for you that you need to go through a surgery that permanently changes who you are. Because we just talked about people don't come out feeling very affirmed on the other side of that anyway. The hardship you go through and your ability to get through it, however long it takes, it's kind of this human innate journey called adolescence. It's almost built in, right? It's built into growing up. The process of feeling lost, it's evolutionarily hardwired. We're supposed to feel that way because you know what the world is full of when you're an adult? It's full of hardship. It's full of hard things. I'm 37 years old. I'm running for president of the United States. First 2 weeks, you know what? There's some things that are pretty hard about that. But not to say that everybody has to run for president at the age of 37, but whatever journey you pick, you're going to encounter your version of hardship. Like evolutionarily, forget even a religious framework here. Evolutionarily, there's a reason we've created, the reason why natural selection created an adolescence that was what it was, that is affirming your humanity. And I think we're in some ways forget even the gender element of this or the cultural element of this, just at an individual level of creating a generation of kids who lose that process of going through the cocoon. You enter as a little bug and you come out as a butterfly that's free to fly around and roam the world as you see fit, all the risks that come with it. That's actually what we're taking aim at. And it's no surprise that you then have a nation of people who have never came out of that cocoon that actually has an entire nation that's lost itself of self-confidence too, which is why this issue, it's not some fringe issue on the outer edge of the so-called culture war. It goes to the heart of why we've lost our sense of self-confidence as a nation, even on the global stage. You know what? I think our foreign policy, our ability to stand up to China, to stand up even to Putin in ways that don't involve just through the back door sending some weapons to his opposition, but actually projecting strength such that the guy would have never done what he did in the first place. Weird as it may sound to say, it's deeply linked to the same pathology, the loss of self-confidence at the individual level that crops up in the form of this toxic gender ideology.
Yeah. Vivek, you're my kind of guy, because I always say, whether you believe in God or evolution, this ideology makes no sense. If you believe in God, this ideology teaches that God made us wrong. Mm-hmm. And if you believe in evolution, you're saying that a billion years of the process of natural selection has somehow failed. And for the first time in human history, during this little 10-year window, we need a pharmaceutical company to help our children be who they really are.
It's actually stunning when you think about it. And I actually do believe in God. I'm a deeply faith-based person and part of a faith-based family as well.
You can believe in both.
I believe in both. I believe evolution is a mechanism through which God works, right? So I laugh at some of my secular religionists who believe that if you believe in, the philosophy of Charles Darwin, somehow that is incompatible with a belief in God, without seeing the more parsimonious view, which is one can be a mechanism through which the other works. But either way, that's a debate for another day. Under either of those, this modern gender ideology is incompatible with either the view that God made you wrong, or the view that actually we have millennia upon millennia of human history and evolution that created us.
We all got through puberty.
Yeah.
For 200,000 years, we've been going through puberty. Kids weren't killing themselves because they were born in the wrong body. But that's the other argument.
If puberty were wrong, would have been selected out through the process of natural selection long ago.
Right.
It's an adaptive characteristic of being able to train for the world with a deeper sense of self-confidence. And this idea of just actually, people label us, and I think today in the Axis sort of we'll fit on the conservative end of the political spectrum.
Sure.
The radical right, even the kinds of things we're talking about here. But this is a fundamentally progressive idea that you should be who you want to be, regardless of what somebody else tells you to be. You can be your own woman. You can be your own man.
That's right.
And you can define that for yourself without having to actually have somebody tell you that you're born into the wrong body or believe that you're born into the wrong body, but just be in your own body the best version of who it is you want to be. That's a progressive idea. I mean, you want to be a hippie, you want to stand up to the system. Today, that's a pretty good way to stand up to the system. And don't call yourself a conservative. Call yourself a heretical hippie. Great. That's actually what you are today, if you say the kinds of things that you're saying on a given day.
Yeah. If a girl wants to climb trees and play in the dirt and hates dresses and wants short hair and wants to be an engineer when she grows up, guess what? She is 100% beautiful girl.
Good for her.
I tell men all the time, it's the tomboys you want to marry.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to each their own is kind of the way I see it.
Sure. But this ideology is just 100% stereotypes. We've got the director of the #1 ranked children's hospital in the country at the Boston Children's Hospital Gender Clinic. This woman is saying that things like a little girl trying to pee standing up, or a little boy who doesn't want to get a haircut, or playing with the opposite gender toys. These are a sign that your child is transgender, and they can treat that.
You know what's really funny about that whole incident that you exposed actually is there's no better way to reveal one's guilt than to delete the video that they created once to advertise the very thing they were deleting. Right, so isn't it right? They went and scrubbed. They went and took it down.
They scrubbed
after you exposed it.
They scrubbed about 40 different videos, but not before I recorded them all.
Good for you.
So I've got them all, and I keep using their own words against them. I don't have to say anything today to convince anyone. I have the words from all these transgender health professionals themselves. I've got the president of WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, admitting on camera that literally none of the boys who started on puberty blockers at Tanner stage 2, which is the beginning of puberty when they're maybe 11 years old, none of them as adults have had any sexual function. They've never been able to have an orgasm. So they are turning children, they are destroying their future adult sexual function, they're sterilizing them, they are maiming them, they are destroying their chance of having a family and reducing their future dating pool to essentially zero. Mm-hmm. And we are to call this love and inclusion, and we're supposed to be silent about this? No. Parents need to speak up. Everyone needs to speak up. And we need the body positive message that our kids are beautiful just as they are. No puberty blockers, hormones, or scalpels needed.
Yeah, I think the guilt is kind of interesting because it shows that they fundamentally agree with much of what you're saying and are still acting otherwise. There's like this concept in criminal law called the mens rea, the state of mind. And that's actually what separates a civil violation in the law from a criminal violation. The civil violation, sometimes you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing and you can be sued and you got to pay damages for it, especially if you harmed somebody else. But to take that to a criminal level, the difference is often the knowledge that you were doing something wrong, the wrong state of mind. And usually the evidence for establishing that is somebody trying to cover up their tracks. And so I think that there's the two layers that I see here. Yeah, is something wrong going on? Even if what they were doing is earnest and proud of it as doctors? Sure it is. I just think for all the reasons we've just talked about, it's the wrong way to affirm a kid's sense of self-confidence to permanently alter them when in fact they're just going through the cocoon, adolescence, figuring out who they really are. But it's another to say that not only were you doing the wrong thing, now you're trying to cover it up once exposed. And that's the difference between a civil violation and a truly criminal or quasi-criminal state of mind. And I just think that, you know, I wonder how far we're going to get. I mean, what do we care about? We care about solving the problem, right? I just think some of us, and I can just tell in our conversation, you're not in this camp at all because you're a successful guy. You could be doing other things. You have been doing other things for much of your life. This hasn't just been a hobby. But people just can sometimes get addicted to the problems that they solve, such that they grow so attached that they almost don't want to see the problem go away. Whereas people like you, people like us, we'd rather find better things to do. There are other problems in the world that need to be solved. I'd rather this one be done and bury it so that we can go on and tackle something else. how do we actually do that, right? Because there's a demand side to this. So we can pass the laws, we can sort of suppress the manifestation of this, which is important for protecting kids today. So I'm all on board for that. But that still strikes me as a form of, since it's a medical conversation, a form of symptomatic therapy. How do we get to the cure?
The ideology is
the
root cause of it.
Yes.
That's what we need. We need to change the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a theory for this. My theory from day one, from before I ever put up the first billboard, was I'm going to create millions of conversations because people need to talk about this. We need to have these nuanced conversations. We need to understand it because as soon as people figure out what's going on, especially parents, the outrage is enormous because this is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This is evil. We are harming tens, hundreds of thousands of kids and young adults who are still caught up in this craze. So we need to keep creating awareness. And eventually, when we hit a critical mass, even these organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics will have to look at their policies and conduct a review of the evidence. But we just need to get the culture to understand again that children are beautiful just as they are, that this ideology is lying to them.
Mm-hmm.
Every cult that ever has success in the world doesn't come out with their most evil basis as their selling point. They have a nice, fluffy, pretty surface layer of things that look appealing.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, no one would ever join it. And so the sales pitch of this true evil that's going on is that they just want to help children to be themselves. It's not helping children to be themselves. But people who don't dig deeper than that, who just hear this surface level argument, they go, yeah, that's wonderful. And especially the left, which is addicted to virtue signaling. This is just one big virtue signal. It's a social status. Even for the parents who are pushing this on their kids, it's a social status thing. So we just need to continually educate the population and we need to change the culture. And we do that by having one conversation at a time. And that snowball gets rolling and it turns into an avalanche. And I think we're at that point where that avalanche is starting to roll because people are finally cluing in.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I just think that this restoration of self-confidence in America, it's one of the things that can dilute a lot of this other poison to irrelevance, right? And I just think we've got to find a way to give kids that sense of conviction. It's all right. We've all been through it. Most of us through human history have. But on the other side of it, you understand who you really are. Okay.
It's a big job, and there's many facets to this.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on in schools is a problem. What's going on in social media is a problem. So like Moms for Liberty is doing, my great friend Tiffany Justice and Tina Deskovich, the co-founders, they now have 115,000 moms in just over 2 years. They're flipping school boards. They are making these school boards aware. We need parents going to these school boards.
They're moms first, right? And
yeah.
So when you think about, family is a source of identity. Right? I think there's got to be something to the fact that it's the erosion of the modern family structure itself that created a vacuum flooded by these new ideologies. I think that racial wokeism is part of that, but today we're talking about gender ideology. Gender ideology is right on the list. And so I do think that, I know it's sort of a passé thing. It's sort of feels like a cloud that's passed in the Republican Party. I think we need to bring that cloud back in terms of actually what does being pro-family actually mean? What do family values actually mean? They've just become a slogan that's a hollowed out husk of themselves. It's so lame sounding on its face that Republicans feel like not saying it. But no, let's go to the content of what it means. What does it mean to revive the actual essence of the family as the best known governing institution known to mankind? These kids are in foster care. Fatherlessness is a major problem. Well, maybe we solve that, actually, and affirm our identity that way. That's a source of self-confidence, too, to know that there are actually parents who care for you and your soul in substance rather than parents who themselves are so lost that they're going to, biologically mutilate you to satisfy their own hunger for meaning. Because it's not just the kids' hunger for meaning. It's actually the parents' hunger for purpose and meaning that's going on here, too. I think that's part of what we've got to get better at in the conservative movement.
Yeah, for decades now, there's been an attack on the nuclear family.
Mm-hmm.
And coming out of academia again, we have this, it's not critical race theory, it's called queer theory. And its job is to strip away all the norms of society. So whatever is deviant, whatever is not acceptable today, they're trying to normalize it. But here's the thing about queer theory. As soon as they make whatever radical notion normal, it's not queer anymore. So then they have to go to the next thing that's even more radical.
Right. And so in a certain sense, and this is what happened with feminism, this is what happened with the gay rights movement, is what was once on the fringe, when that itself becomes the new center of gravity, there has to be something else that the fringe pulls you towards. There's something biblical about them. It's sort of like a invisible spiritual warfare. I mean, this is
a war.
Satanic.
This is a war.
In a sense, because it's a constant denial of whatever the epicenter of truth is. We're going to pull you into literally the absence of any fixed structure at all. And the irony is, I think we talked about this the first time we ever met, actually. It takes us back to, it reminds me of one of those conversations was, even if you're on the fringe and in orbit around a center, you need a center in order to even locate yourself as being on the fringe. But once that notion of actually having a fixed structure and ordering of a culture is gone, then it's the beginning of the end as you know it, because there is no definition or structure that human beings can latch onto. And I think that's what serially happens when you actually take what let's say, family foundation, national foundation, God as a foundation for belief. When those things disappear, you lose the sun and the solar system. The planets around it have nothing to revolve around. They're just lost and going off into each of their own abyss. And that's kind of what's going on here with we see on full display with the rise of this gender ideology.
Yeah, these are radical concepts that have been normalized, and everyone's been afraid to speak up about them because they've been confused as well. And that's one way you control a population is you confuse them. You change the terminology for everything. They don't call these radical elective double mastectomies. They call them top surgeries. Mm-hmm. But what I need every Republican to understand, I need everyone to understand this, and this has always been my message to Republicans, though, is that this is such a winning issue.
Yeah, as a political matter. Yeah, exactly.
As a political matter. Unfortunately, at the political class, this has been politicized. So no one in the Democratic Party as a politician will speak out about this. Mm-hmm. But I've had more conversations with people on the street than anyone in the world. And I can tell you it's probably about 92% of the population who supports me. Guess who really supports me the most? The Black community and the Hispanic community. They love the nuclear family. They hate this queer theory business. Yeah. They all stand with me. I hardly ever have any objections. But for some reason, they feel they need to vote for the Democrats because they've been taught that those are who represents their interests.
I mean, that's an electoral scam we're going to break in 2024. Yeah. But the only thing I would say to go further, I love that. Thank you. It's like basic advice that every Republican, and frankly, some Democrats, for that matter, should take Absolutely. As well. And so I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat.
Right.
The majority of people in this country do not want to actually harm our children. I think there's sort of two categories. You don't mess with my kids. Yeah. Most importantly, you don't mess with my money. Most of which I've been focused on in the last couple of years is you don't mess with my money. That's what the ESG cancer is all about. But if there's one thing that matters even more than that, you don't mess with my kids. That's a unifying issue for the country. But I just hope Republicans also go further to understand the why, right? Because I think that a lot of Republican politicians are particularly good at taking a new slogan, gender ideology, great. Woke. When I was introducing the term woke into the lexicon a couple of years ago in the world of conservative politics, a lot of political folks were telling me, no, people don't know what that means. Stop talking about it. Now I have the opposite problem where actually too many people are running with it without actually even knowing the essence of what they're saying. So all I would say is, yes, take this and run with it. You've been a great leader on this. But don't just be a billiard ball that's just hitting whatever direction it goes. Know why you're doing it. Know what's actually at stake. Go to the root cause and address that too. Don't just trend for a Twitter cycle and then do high fives in the back room. I think that's what I see a lot of Republican politicians do these days. But do the harder work of reviving actual family values. How do you revive a family foundation? How can you do that in the shadow of culture and even in the shadow of our politics and the laws we create? How do you actually revive a national identity? How do you actually revive the space for faith by protecting religious liberty? Those are the kinds of things that go upstream and make sure that we don't get these, these diseases that really just show up as symptoms of that deeper vacuum. And I would say step up beyond just getting a little Twitter cycle and a bunch of likes around it, which is, easy to do. The harder work is to go upstream and do the real thing. That would be what I'd add for a lot of these Republican politicians.
Yeah, this is the number one cultural issue that strikes the most passion in people. It generates the most passion, especially parents. Because as parents, the only thing we care about is our kids. That's why we exist. That's why we work so hard. We want to leave a legacy for them. I refuse to send my girls out into a world that doesn't know what a woman is anymore. And I refuse to live in a society that's trying to change the sex of kids. But one thing that politicians can do is these parents' bills of rights in every state and federally. Because ultimately, parents, we don't co-parent with the government.
Yep.
We are the first and primary educators of our own children. But when schools are allowed to hide curricula from parents, and when schools are keeping secrets from parents, as they are doing with the transition of children, well, that has to come to a halt. And then a lot of this social contagion would come to a halt. Because like I just spoke to a woman in Virginia from Loudoun County just last week. For 7 months, the school was hiding from her that her daughter, starting on the first day of school, was going by a boy's name and pronouns. So that's 6 or 7 months this mom could have tried to intervene and given her daughter the body positive message that she's beautiful and she doesn't need to change anything about herself. But parents' rights are being taken away as well. That's another huge issue. So that's another huge focal point that all of these Republicans should focus on, because when you do that, when you stand up for parents and you stand up for kids, you do nothing but win all day long.
And I think that's actually one of the critical ingredients to this idea of this national revival. Because what does that mean? We're actually reviving the nation, starting with that next generation. And I'm so grateful for people like you who clearly, just the way you did this demonstrated that it's not about you. I love it. You've been, you were a financial advisor before, and you literally took it upon yourself to put up a billboard and become a literal walking human billboard. And, I love your self-acknowledgement. I know it looks ridiculous to some people. Well, you know what? You're doing it for a cause, and you're doing it for something that matters. And, I hope that your courage is contagious, right? Fear has become so infectious in our country, but courage can be contagious too, as long as more people are willing to be courageous. And, I would just say, don't back down. People will make fun of you. They'll laugh at you. They'll dismiss you. They'll attack you. You've already had that experience. It's just part of the table stakes of doing something that matters. And, I'm an optimist. I think we're going to get this right. And, since I met you and learned a little bit more about what you've done, so I wanted you to be part of this, is we got to set an example for other people to follow. And so keep up the good work, man.
Thank you so much. I'm an optimist as well. I know we're going to win this battle. It's simply a question of how many kids are harmed before we do. So thank you so much for having me.
I'm Vivek Ramaswamy, candidate for president, and I approve this message.
Paid for by Vivek 2024.